Hi everyone, and welcome to video number 20 on Weimar Germany and the rise of the Nazi Party. This video, ladies and gentlemen, it's all about how the Nazis tried to establish control. In the previous videos, I've talked about how they got control by using force and fear, the F factor. In this video, ladies and gentlemen, it's a slightly different approach. What the Nazis tried to do was use persuasion and propaganda, the P factor. The aim was the same, establish control, almost as if they are controlling people's minds. Ooh, you are under my control. The light won't work. That's better. You are under my control. I am controlling your mind. That's what the Nazis were trying to do. What did they do? How successful was it? That's what this video, hopefully, is going to talk about. Now, the main man in all of this is a man called Joseph Goebbels, 1933. Joseph Goebbels. Notice the spelling. Goebbels, Goebbels, not gerbils. The amount of times I've had to correct that. It's Goebbels. Joseph Goebbels becomes Minister of Public Propaganda and Enlightenment. Enlightenment, shining a light, increasing understanding. But ladies and gentlemen, it was an understanding from the Nazi perspective. Goebbels wanted to control people's minds. And how did he do it? Excuse me. He used censorship and then he used propaganda. Now, first of all, censorship. What do we mean if something is censored? Any ideas? Well, here's a definition for you. Controlling people's attitudes, controlling their views and their opinions by banning information. So you are limiting what the public can see or read. And he did that by banning certain things so it couldn't appear on the radio, in books, in newspapers. We'll have a look at that later in this video. 1933, the Reich Press Law was passed. Remember, Hitler is now able to control the laws, the Enabling Act. He's basically stopping any left-wing journalism, anything that would be critical of the Nazis. By 1935, just 2 years later, 1,600 newspapers had been closed down. 1,600. And those that remained open, editors were told what to print. There is the censorship. You must print this or we will close you down. And of course, what they were told to print was the Nazi message, the Nazi perspective. And books, as I'll mention later, books were burned. Books by communists such as Marx and Engels. But other books were burned as well. I'll talk about that in a minute. So that's the first approach, censorship, limiting the information. Even in today's world, we have a little bit of that, ladies and gentlemen. You may have heard of a recent phrase called fake news. Can you trust what you are shown on the internet, in a newspaper, on television, on the radio, on all the social media? Fake news. And Germany was doing this back in 1933 onwards. Goebbels was a master of controlling the news and using effectively fake news. The second thing is the propaganda or persuasion. Book by Jane Austen, Persuasion. I had to study Jane Austen for A-level many, many years ago. Goodness me. Persuasion, persuading people, trying to get inside their minds and persuade them that what you are saying is correct. Propaganda. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we have big companies, spending millions and millions of pounds on advertising. Why? Because they want you to buy their stuff. They are trying to persuade you. And the Nazis were doing this back in the 1930s by using propaganda. Now, what does that mean? Controlling people's attitudes or views or opinions by persuasion, pushing certain information, certain opinions towards the public. Now, Goebbels came up with, is attributed to a very, very famous quote. He says, "If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it." Wow. He's admitting, yes, this is a lie, but I don't care, because if I repeat and repeat and repeat, people will believe it's true. And that was his approach. Use propaganda, control the message, push the lie, and people will believe you. Wow. Let's have a look at various different parts of German society and have a look at how Goebbels manipulated, used persuasion and propaganda to push his message. First of all, the press, the newspapers. 1933, when Hitler became Chancellor, roughly 3% of German newspapers were Nazi. They had the Nazi message. Remember what I said? 1,600 newspapers closed down, replaced by Nazi newspapers. So that 3% rose very quickly to 80%. 80% of the newspapers are pushing Goebbels and Hitler's Nazi message. The message is getting across. The newspapers. What about radio? All radio stations were controlled by the Nazis. There were cheap, mass-produced radios in 70% of German homes, which was the highest in Europe, highest percentage by 1939, start of World War II. They were called the People's Radios. Quite cheap, so people would buy them. And they had a particular design, which meant you could not get a foreign radio station. So you could not get another point of view. You were only provided with the Nazi message, propaganda, fake news. And Goebbels actually said that the radio was a very, very important weapon in the information war. So we've had newspapers, radios. What else were there? Posters. Germany was covered in posters, and the posters had the message, the Nazi message, Hitler, the Nazis, Germany, the way forward. Posters were everywhere. Very direct, very simple messages, often aimed at the youth. If you can get the youth on side, they will grow up accepting your message. So the use of posters was very important for control. Rallies, huge rallies were organised, spectacular rallies. Often they'd have at least 250,000 people there. The flags, the uniforms, well organised. Again, appealing to the young. Link it to the chaos of Germany in the previous years. Now the Nazis are presenting this uniformed, well-organised society. That would be popular. Often at night, and they would all be carrying torchlights. It was a spectacular image, and people wanted to be involved. Now there was an annual huge mass rally in a place called Nuremberg, and then other special occasions, for example, Hitler's birthday. So rallies were used again as a form of control. Look at us, join with us, we will make Germany great. Please let us control you. That's the message. Other areas where Goebbels tries to push his message for control. The cinema. Now you've got to remember, back then the television had only recently been invented. Very, very few people had access to a television set. Many people would go to the cinema very, very regularly. By 1933, the audience was 250 million people went to the cinema in Germany. So it was a huge audience. Goebbels realised this and he thought, I can get my message in. So there'd be a 45-minute official newsreel pushing Hitler and the Nazi message in the cinema before the main film came on. Also, all of the films had to go to Goebbels for his approval. So if you are daring to make anything critical of Hitler, it will not be shown in the cinema. Only certain films would be shown. Now, there was a very famous film producer at that time called Leni Riefenstahl, and a very famous film, Triumph of the Will, showing the triumph of Hitler's Germany. So cinema again was used for propaganda, or, if you like, to brainwash people. Now, I mentioned earlier about books. May 1933, in the city of Berlin, 20,000 books were burned in the streets. Books, for example, by great scientists such as Albert Einstein. Of course, Einstein was a Jew, which would not be welcome in Hitler's Germany. Authors were forced to write books praising Hitler. Now, many authors refused, and in this period, 2,500 authors or writers actually left Germany, including great authors like Mann and Brecht, Thomas Mann, Bertolt Brecht. Can we see, though, if they're leaving and their books are being burned, what message is left for the German people? The Nazi message. Can you see how it's working? Control by propaganda. So literature, books were also used along with cinema. What about music? Surely music can't be used, but it was. Very famous composer called Mendelssohn, Jewish, so his work is automatically banned. There were new styles of music coming out in the 1920s and the 1930s, particularly jazz, banned in Nazi Germany because of its link to black people. They did not want that. Instead, the Nazis wanted traditional German music. German folk was very popular, folk traditional music, German classical music. Composers such as Bach, Beethoven, and Hitler's own favourite, Wagner. They were the popular classical composers that were played everywhere during the time of Hitler in the 1930s. German heroes, if you like, according to Hitler. The theatre, another area of culture. Well, the plays that were put on showed German history, German politics. Cheap tickets were arranged so that the public could go and see these plays giving the message of German history through the eye of the Nazis, of course. What about art? Now remember, Hitler considered himself to be an artist. He tried to get into art school as a young man and was turned down, and he was absolutely devastated by that. So he considered himself to be an expert on art. What he did not like or approve of was modern art. He thought that that was like degenerate, dreadful, disgraceful, and as a result, artists of the caliber, world-class, unbelievable artists like Picasso, Van Gogh, Cézanne, their works were removed. All artists had to become members of the Reich Chamber of Visual Arts. Hitler wanted paintings which only showed traditional German values, showing the role of the man as the sort of job seeker and the worker and the money earner, and then the woman looking after the children, looking after the family. They often showed the family together. Everyone's healthy. Loads of hard work was going on. Sat listening to the radio with Hitler's message coming out of the people's radio. So he's using art to again support and push his message. Even architecture, even the buildings that were put up in Germany in the 1930s. Now, his favourite architect was a man called Albert Speer. And the buildings of that time were based on the monumental style. The buildings were huge, huge buildings, often in the Greek and Roman, the traditional historic design. Because to go back to the Greeks and the Romans, the Nazis would say, that was a time when the buildings were not contaminated by the Jews from the Nazi perspective. So, nearly every element of German society was used to push the message of the Nazis and Hitler. Propaganda. Now, I've left one right till the end because, one, it's important, two, it's one of my favourite things. Sport. Sport. Hitler was interested in what was called Nazifying sport. These new stadiums that were built, remember, in the monumental style, huge buildings, all sport was important because for Hitler, health and fitness was important because the boys would grow up to be men, soldiers to fight in the war. The girls would grow up healthy to be women, to have lots of children to then go and fight in the war. Can you see? Sport and health and fitness was at the centre of the Nazi idea. 1936, Berlin hosted the Olympic Games. And of course, they had a huge new Olympic stadium. 110,000 people could fit in it. It was the biggest in the world. And it was a very well organised event. Remember that producer, Leni Riefenstahl, filmed it and made a film of the Berlin Olympics. Even a Jew was allowed in the German team. Why would that be, do you think? Well, to give you an idea, the signs which had been in Germany since Hitler took over, saying Jews are not welcome in this area, those signs were taken down for the Berlin Olympics. Why do you think that would be? Yes, of course. Hitler realised the eyes of the world were on Berlin for those 2 weeks. So he's trying to show a message to the world about how good and welcoming and friendly and nice the Nazis actually were. Of course, it was just a show. It wasn't reality. It was fake news. But the Olympics, Hitler wanted to show that the German way of life was the best. And actually, the German team won most medals. 33 golds, 26 silvers, 30 bronze medals. They were very, very successful. In one way, you could argue that the Berlin Olympics did give Hitler, Germany and Nazism a boost. Hitler was there in the stadium, often presenting the medals. He was very proud. One story which tends to undermine that. The most famous athlete in the Berlin Olympics. Do you know the person's name? A black American athlete called Jesse Owens. And famously, he won 4 gold medals. The 100 metres, the 200 metres, the relay and the long jump. This upset Hitler hugely because remember, he thought that the Germans, the white Aryan race, was supreme. He didn't want a black American beating his German athletes. So he was very upset by this. Very famously in the long jump, Jesse Owens was jumping, but he kept on doing a foul until, ironically, a German athlete helped him with his run-up. And once he'd done that, Jesse Owens got the gold and that German athlete got the silver. Just a little story for you there. But what I've tried to show you in this video is that Goebbels, this Minister for Propaganda, 1933, the Reich Chamber of Culture was set up, led by Goebbels. Goebbels was in charge of that. So the whole of German culture, theatre, cinema, music, art, architecture, all controlled by Goebbels, pushing the message, pushing the lie. Go back to that quote I gave you earlier from Goebbels. If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. And that's what happened in Nazi Germany. So on the one side, we've seen the fear and the force, the terror to get control. On the other side, the persuasion and the propaganda. Put them both together, and it's a very effective means of gaining control of people's minds. But despite all of that, there were some people who opposed Hitler. They actually went against all of this control. Who were they? What did they do? How successful was their opposition? That's coming in the next video. As ever, I hope it's been useful. Speak to you soon. All the best now.